Hello, everyone. Welcome to this gathering of the heritage sector on Bill C-23, new federal heritage legislation, Projet de loi C-23, nouvelle loi fédérale. We'll just give it a few minutes for people to join the call. And while we're waiting, why don't you go ahead and say hello in the chat? Tell us if you're representing an organization or what your interest is in this conversation today, where you're participating from. We're hoping to convene a very interactive conversation today. So gear up to raise your hand and use the chat function and the Q&A function to be part of the conversation. In fact, we'd intended this meeting to be a big open conversation, as we typically do with our gatherings, but we've actually exceeded our capacity with our Zoom arrangements. So if you would like to be promoted to a panelist and be on the screen during the discussion part of the session today, feel free to indicate that to us in the chat, and I think we'll be sharing those instructions as well. So our conversation today, my name is Natalie Bull, Executive Director of the National Trust, and the Trust is pleased to convene these conversations to invite everyone from across the country participating in the heritage places sector to be part of shaping the future of our field. You've probably heard us say many times, Canada is the only G7 country without laws to protect heritage places owned or recognized by its national government. And on June 7th this year, the Honourable Steven Guilbeault, Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and the Minister responsible for Parks Canada actually made a move to close that gap, tabling Bill C-323 in Parliament. So that's our conversation today. We're going to be hearing from colleagues at Parks Canada about the scope and the content of this bill. And then in the second part of our session today, we will convene as a sector and talk about our recommendations, how the sector can proceed to provide comment and to influence the progress of this bill through to being law. I just wanted to mention, and maybe my colleagues will share in the chat, in advance of the bill being drafted, many individuals and organizations were invited to provide input, and the National Trust and its National Council partner organizations, national and provincial, came together around a set of recommendations that we did provide to government in advance. So that can be part of our work in assessing what we're actually seeing in this proposed legislation. Before we go further, I would like to acknowledge the traditional territory, unceded territory of Indigenous peoples. We're all participating from different parts of the country. I'm here in New Brunswick on the traditional unceded territory of the Wolastoqey people. And I think it's an important thing for us to always remind ourselves of traditional territory and the contribution, past, present, and future, of Indigenous peoples to the rich cultural heritage that we all care about. I mentioned our limit on having everybody's face on the screen, but again, feel free to let us know in the chat if you'd like to be pulled into the conversation. La présentation aujourd'hui sera dans les deux langues officielles. N'hésitez pas de poser les questions dans la langue de votre choix. We'll have a bilingual presentation from our colleagues from Parks Canada today, and just encouraging everyone to ask questions in the language of your choice, and we'll all do our best to have a conversation. This session will be recorded. You'll receive a recording, I think, within 24 hours, including the chat record, which is often very interesting to read as well. So I'd like to introduce our special guests today who will be presenting. We have John Aldag, Member of Parliament from Cloverdale-Langley City in British Columbia. And John has been an important champion for heritage over the years in his time as an elected official, and was really the sort of spearheaded the report from the Environment Committee in 2016-2017 that really lays out much of the agenda for the sector around heritage in this country. Unfortunately, we have Geneviève Charrois, Director of Cultural Heritage Legislation, Policy and Planning at Parks Canada. Christine Lothbone, unfortunately, is not able to join us today. We also have Norman Shields, who is the Manager of Cultural Heritage Legislation and Regulations at Parks. So thanks so much to our three panelists representing elected officials and colleagues, civil servants at Parks Canada. So I think I'll turn it over to you. I know, Geneviève, you have a presentation to show, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. Again, put your questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and I don't know, Geneviève, would you prefer to present and then take questions?
It might be much simpler just because I'm the presenter and I will need to share my screen. I may not be able to follow what's going on in the chat as well. So maybe I'll do the presentation and take questions right after.
Okay, but before you start, I just want to say as well that we have lots of wonderful colleagues here on the screen who joined as panelists. And many more participating in this conversation. I'll just mention a few. We've got colleagues from Heritage Ottawa, from the Indigenous Heritage Circle, from the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals, from Ecomos Canada, from the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario. We've got staff from provincial heritage departments, from cities across Canada, city staff. We've got people from Lighthouse Preservation Groups, National Capital Commission, Public Works Canada, Ontario Heritage Trust, Edmonton Heritage Council. Many entities and organizations are interested in this conversation and part of it today. And rather than try and introduce everyone, I'll just ask you, when you make an intervention or ask a question, maybe just signal if you are affiliated with a particular organization. So thanks so much, and over to you, Geneviève.
Well, a big thank you for offering Parks Canada to present an overview of Bill C-23 today. I would also like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. As such, I pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship to this territory. J'aimerais aussi reconnaître respectueusement que les terres, les eaux et les glaces sur lesquelles nous vivons et travaillons partout au Canada et dont nous prenons soin sont les territoires ancestraux et les terres natales des Premières Nations, des Inuits et des Métis. Nous espérons que le travail que nous réalisons aujourd'hui et dans notre quotidien fait honneur à leurs relations, leurs récits et leurs histoires. So I will start projecting my screen. So I'll do my best to manage this, but I will be doing dual task here. So apology if it's going, something goes wrong. I believe that everyone can see the first slide of the show. Can I get to Tom? Yeah, okay, thank you. That's fantastic. I am pleased to join you today for a briefing on Bill C-23, District Places of Canada Act. During this presentation, I will provide an overview of the most important parts of the bill as it is presently stands as first reading. I will then be pleased to answer a few questions. Donc, le 7 juin 2022, le projet de loi C-23, loi sur les lieux historiques du Canada, a été déposé à la Chambre des communes par l'Honourable Steven Guilbeault, ministre de l'Environnement et du Changement climatique et ministre responsable de Parcs Canada. On June 7th, as mentioned by Nathalie, Bill C-23, Historic Places of Canada Act, was introduced in the House of Commons by the Honourable Steven Guilbeault, Canada's Minister of Environment and Climate Change and Minister responsible for Parks Canada. The bill was written by Justice drafters according to drafting instructions approved by Cabinet on March 2021. It is currently just past the first reading in the House of Commons. It's the beginning of the parliamentary process. And you can follow the progress of the bill on the Parliament of Canada website. At this time, Parks Canada, we wouldn't be able to know when or if the bill will proceed to the next stage of the parliamentary process. If it does continue its route into parliamentary process, there would be a second reading once House of Commons is back to normal duties. And then it would be deferred to a parliamentary committee, get to a third reading in the House of Commons, At that stage, the bill, with or without amendments, would be sent to Senate, where an equivalent process would take place. In a nutshell, the bill is at its earliest stage related to parliamentary process, still having to get to the passing through the parliamentary process, and it's under the purview of Parliament to decide at which speed things will go. Parks Canada is then not in position to say how much time this will require and or if it will ever go. As Bill 23 is being considered by the House of Commons, it is really the purview of Parliament to conduct the business. So Parks Canada will not impinge upon or interfere with the parliamentary process, nor can it is assumed that the outcome of this process would come to eventual an end. But there's debate and this will happening in Parliament. Donc, par conséquent, la présentation d'aujourd'hui portera sur les dispositions du projet de loi tel qu'il a été déposé au Parlement. Therefore, today's briefing will focus on Bill C-23 provisions as introduced in Parliament. So if passed by Parliament as written, the bill would provide for a transparent and inclusive designation framework for places, persons, and events of national historic significance or national interest. It also would provide for the sustainable protection of the over 300 fairly owned historic places that are located in every province and territory across the country. Bill C-23 is based on three fundamental principles: transparency, inclusion, and sustainability. Donc, les trois principes qui soutiennent le projet de loi se déclinent ainsi: des renseignements accessibles, complets et opportuns, ainsi que des processus clairs, transparents et uniformes. Une participation accrue du public au processus de désignation et une intendance responsable des lieux historiques appartenant au gouvernement fédéral. So these principles support accessible, complete, and timely information, as well as clear, transparent, and consistent processes, enhanced public participation in the designation process, and responsible stewardship of fairly owned historic places. Places, persons, and events of national historic significance or national interest helped to tell Canada's diverse history. Bill C-23, if passed and as written, would recognize their importance and establish the minister's responsibility for making designations. Canadians want designations to better reflect the diversity of the country's history, and in particular, the history of Indigenous peoples. Le projet de loi établirait donc un cadre transparent et inclusif pour la désignation qui appuierait un processus pour des désignations qui représentent l'étendue et la profondeur de l'histoire du Canada et qui sont significatives pour les Canadiens. This bill would establish an inclusive and transparent designation framework that would support a process for designations that represent the breadth and depth of the history of Canada and are meaningful to Canadians. Tel que libellé, la Commission des lieux et monuments historiques du Canada continuerait de formuler les recommandations au ministre relatives à la désignation de lieux, de personnes et d'événements d'importance historique nationale ou d'intérêt national. As the bill is drafted, the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada would continue to make recommendations to the Minister on the designation of places, persons, and events of national historic significance or national interest. If Bill C-23 is adopted by Parliament as written, new measures to support inclusion and transparency would include clear decision-making process, publicly available information about federal historic places on a public register, a single body making designation recommendations to the minister, which would be the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada, and we would have the name or the reasons for the designation that could be modified and a designation revoked. This makes place for when a controversial or problematic designation is in dispute, including a designation that can be rooted in colonial views of history. En outre des dispositions générales qui avanceraient l'inclusion et la transparence, le projet de loi C-23 serait une étape importante pour assurer que les désignations intègrent les histoires, les valeurs patrimoniales et les pratiques de la mémoire autochtone. In addition to the general provisions that would advance inclusion and transparency, Bill C-23 would mark an important step forward to ensure designations integrate Indigenous histories, heritage values, and memory practices. Tel que libellé, le projet de loi C-23 modifierait la composition de la Commission des lieux et monuments historiques du Canada par l'ajout de 3 nouveaux représentants, un pour les Premières Nations, un pour les Inuits et un pour les Métis. As drafted, Bill C-23 would modify the composition of the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada to include 3 new representatives, one for First Nations, one for Inuit, and one for Métis. The new positions would directly address Call to Action 79.1 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. These representatives would be appointed by the Governing Council following consultations with Indigenous communities. Additionally, as drafted, the bill would ensure that the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada takes into account Indigenous knowledge when making recommendations to the minister. Enfin, qu'à la demande d'un corps dirigeant autochtone, des renseignements sur des lieux patrimoniaux autres que des lieux historiques du Canada pourraient aussi être versés au registre. Finally, the proposed public register would be open to Indigenous governments and governing bodies to list, at their request, important places recognized by them as a place of heritage value or significance. Comme certains d'entre vous le savez, la grande majorité des lieux historiques dont l'Agence Parc Canada ou d'autres ministères fédéraux ont la gestion ne bénéficient pas d'une protection juridique. S'il est adopté par le Parlement, le projet de loi C-23 changerait la donne. As some of you are aware, the vast majority of historic places administered by the Parks Canada Agency and other departments are not legally protected. If adopted by Parliament, Bill C-23 would address this issue. The bill would provide that the minister may designate a place of national historic significance or national interest to be a historic place of Canada. Certain places already designated under laws or policies would be deemed to be historic places of Canada and would be protected under the Act. So this slide is showing to you a few examples of these places, but I can also mention a few. Lanceau Meadows National Historic Site would be considered a historic place as per the definition provided in the Act. Squamigan, Port-la-Joie, Fort Amherst would be also one. Le manège militaire sur la Grande Allée à Québec, classified federal buildings, would become an historic place. Grand Pré, National Historic Site, du historique national du Canada des fortifications de Québec. The 9 historic canals that Parks Canada is responsible for, including the Chine Canal and Rideau Canal in Ottawa. Parliament buildings in Ottawa would also be covered by the provisions in the Act. L'édifice de la Cour suprême, Supreme Court of Canada. Do I have others? Oui, lieu historique national de Batoche en Saskatchewan, Bayou Ranch in Alberta, Saoué and Dacho in the Northwestern Territories, and Dawson Historical Complex, National Historic Site of Canada, owned by Ministry of Parks Canada. Bill C-23, if passed as written by Parliament, would establish consistent legal protection for more than 300 federal historic places under the administration of federal institutions. Les institutions fédérales qui administrent des lieux historiques fédéraux sont les suivantes. L'Agence Parc Canada, qui, comme vous le voyez sur la diapositive, a la grande majorité de ces lieux sous son administration. La Défense nationale, Service public et approvisionnement Canada, Pêche et Océan Canada. Et je vais également mentionner la Commission de la capitale nationale, qui est couverte par le projet de loi, ainsi que d'autres institutions fédérales, qui représentent 5% de la tarte complète. So other federal institutions aside Parks Canada, who is the biggest administrator of historic places in federal government, would be National Defense, Public Services and Procurement Canada, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, the National Capital Commission. I will mention it. It's an institution that is already covered and included in the Historic Places Act, and other federal institutions that represent 5% of this big pie of places, historic places, federally owned. So as currently provided for in Bill C-23, the public register would promote transparency and sustainability by ensuring the public and decision makers have important information about the federal historic places, including their condition and any planned action that may result in a physical change that may affect the heritage value of the historic place. Bill C-23 would foster the rehabilitation of historic places and their adaptation to climate change, thereby contributing to a green and sustainable future for Canadians. Les mesures de durabilité qui appuient la protection et la conservation des lieux historiques fédéraux sont des éléments fondamentaux du projet de loi. Sustainability measures that support the protection and conservation of federal historic places are fundamental components of this bill. Une des mesures les plus notables du projet de loi C-23, s'il est adopté tel qu'écrit, serait la codification des normes et lignes directrices pour la conservation des lieux patrimoniaux au Canada, qui établirait un barème commun dans la loi pour l'intendance des lieux historiques fédéraux. One of the most notable measures of Bill C-23, if passed as written, would be the codification of the standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places in Canada, which would establish a common benchmark in law for the stewardship of federal historic places. Federal institutions would be legally required to take the standards and guidelines into account before intervening at a federal historic place. There are other measures that support protection and conservation of the heritage value of federal historic places as the bill is currently written. These include requiring that federal authorities consult the Parks Canada agency before undertaking any action at the federal historic place that may result in a physical change that could affect that place's heritage value and or disposing of a federal historic place. Le projet de loi prévoit aussi des pouvoirs de réglementer afin de protéger les lieux historiques fédéraux dont l'Agence Parc Canada a la gestion. Regulation making powers to protect federal historic places that are under the administration of the Parks Canada Agency would also be provided for in this bill. If the bill is adopted as drafted, the regulations would provide for the protection of cultural, historical, and archaeological resources of a federal historic place and also for the prohibition of certain activities at those places. Finally, as noted, the public register would improve access to information about historic places, including federal historic places. As drafted, Bill C-23 responds to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's Call to Action 79.1 and would address recent calls to better protect Canada's historic places. Cela comprend les recommandations du Comité permanent de l'environnement du développement durable, NV, dans Préserver le patrimoine du Canada, les fondements de notre avenir, publié en 2017. Des recommandations faites par le vérificateur général du Canada, la conservation des biens patrimoniaux fédéraux, un rapport de 2018, ainsi que 2 tables rondes du ministre responsable de Parcs Canada en 2017 et en 2020. So these former and other recommendations include recommendations from the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development, the ENVI Committee, in the report Preserving Canada's Heritage, the Foundation for Tomorrow in 2017, the Auditor General of Canada Conserving Federal Heritage Properties report in 2018, and 2 ministers roundtable, minister responsible for Parks Canada, one in 2017 and one in 2020. In particular, if adopted by Parliament as written, Bill C-23 would directly address ENVI's recommendations for legal protection for federal historic places, which are recommendations 5 and 6. So in closing, I want to acknowledge that the development of Bill C-23 relied on engagement with key partners and stakeholders, including the National Trust for Canada. Des discussions avec cet organisme ainsi que la mobilisation avec nos partenaires autochtones et avec les provinces et les territoires ont joué un rôle important pour faire progresser la proposition législative. Engagement with all organizations, cultural heritage organizations, engagement with Indigenous partners and provinces and territories played an important role in advancing this legislative proposal. Your support is truly appreciated. I will now do my best to answer a few questions you may have, but please remember that Bill C-23 is before Parliament. As a public servant, as an official, I must not be perceived to engage in any kind of debate about the bill, as that privilege belongs solely to Parliament. Donc, c'est pour cette raison, ça va me faire plaisir de répondre à des questions factuelles par rapport au projet de loi, mais à nouveau, je ne peux pas intervenir dans des décisions au-delà que des réponses très techniques sur le projet de loi tel qu'il est écrit en ce moment. So again, a big thank you for your time and happy to take a few questions.
Thank you so much, Geneviève. So there are lots of questions, lots of very knowledgeable people on the call today, and I'm hoping my colleagues are, I think we'll have to prioritize to make sure we hit some of the high points, but this is really the beginning of this conversation, not our only opportunity. Maybe while we're getting organized with questions, I'm wondering, John, would you like to say a few words about the bill?
Absolutely. Thanks, Natalie. And good morning from the sunny West Coast. Good afternoon to those of you who are in parts of Eastern Canada. By way of introduction, I'm John Aldag, the Member of Parliament for Cloverdale-Langley City, a hotbed of heritage conservation in Canada. Well, not really. But for those who don't know me, you might be wondering why I'm involved in this. And briefly, I had spent 34 years prior to being elected with Parks Canada, working in both national parks and national historic sites. I was first elected in 2015 in the 42nd Parliament and served on the Environment Committee, and was able to champion having a study done on built heritage, the first one that we could find that had ever been done by a standing committee. And we came up with a report that has very much pushed on the government to deal with frankly, outdated heritage legislation. I think the last real run that had been taken, I see a former colleague, Christina Cameron here, when she was Director General for National Historic Sites, there was some work done in the early 2000s, but there's a lot of work that is still outstanding. And so this legislation is a response to the Environment Committee's report. I would say that by observation of it, it's a very strong first step in addressing the issues of heritage conservation and focuses on getting the federal house in order. It also takes some of the work. I had a private member's bill, C-374 in the 42nd Parliament, that was to implement Call to Action 79.1, which was adding Indigenous representatives to the Historic Sites and Monuments Board. And you, through Genevieve's presentation, see that that is reflected. and it moves toward strengthening work and collaboration with Indigenous communities across Canada. Is this the final solution to heritage conservation in Canada? I would say no. There is a lot more work that needs to be done, but this is a very strong first step, and really focuses on getting that federal house in order and giving federally owned properties protections that currently do not exist. The reason that I'm here is that I will be part of the parliamentary process, and I'm very interested in hearing from all of you about what you see as the strengths and weaknesses. I've already been working on the House Leader to try to make sure that the Bill C-23, yes, has a place in the fall legislative calendar. And as Genevieve mentioned, right now it's first reading, it's only been introduced in the House. And so the role is to make sure that we actually get it through second reading. I'll be participating in the debates, getting it to committee. It will go to the Environment Committee. And I'm hoping that those who have, are able to provide constructive criticism will perhaps be able to put themselves forward as witnesses for the legislation at the committee stage. It'll then go to the House for third reading, and then on to the Senate, where it will also need some encouragement and to get through the Senate process. So we have a long way to go through the legislation, but I think that if we can get the heritage community behind this legislation, we can push that through and get it done. And then we can actually turn to the conversation about what's next needed to support heritage conservation in Canada. So I'll leave it at that, and happy to participate in any questions that you might have on from whatever I can do. But I see there's tons of really good questions here, and look forward to the conversation, both the rest of this morning and into the coming weeks and months as the bill gets before the House. So thank you for everybody's interest in this.
Great, thanks so much, John. So let's take a couple of questions. I think we're going to have to agree that many of these questions will be responded to in writing. I'm hoping that Genevieve and her colleagues can help answer these questions, and we'll make sure that it gets shared out to this group and beyond. But I guess right off the bat, the bill basically covers two areas. One is designation of national places of national historic significance. So I'm wondering if there are any immediate questions about that side of the bill. Chris, what are you seeing in the chat? Can you sort of pull up some priority questions? They're all good. It's actually a bit overwhelming to think about which ones we could pick and respond to live.
I'll look for those, but Natalie, Karen Aird has her hand up there.
Great. No, go ahead, Karen, and just introduce yourself and make your comment or question.
Dunsi, everyone. My name is Karen Aird, and I'm the acting president and co-founder of the National Indigenous Heritage Circle. I'm also the Culture and Heritage Manager for First Peoples Cultural Council in BC. I have quite a few questions, so I'll just focus. I know there's not enough time to answer them, but the first one is, I noticed that the legislation is quite void on reference to UNDRIP. So how, the preamble doesn't express the adoption of UNDRIP. So how is that going to be addressed? And the other question I have, is there going to be direct support for Indigenous organizations and communities to participate in the development of the implementation of legislation?
So I will take a few questions, but as mentioned, there are things I cannot respond to. So I get that Natalie has made a nice offer that we would take the question and respond to them all. It's not going to be possible just because we're under parliamentary process as we go. But to go back to your two questions, UNDRIP is, as you know, the UN Declarations Act is now active. Has been adopted. So this would supersede anything that is in these historic places when it comes to rights to Indigenous peoples. This is the primary concern of federal government. So we would need to go along the lines that are provided in the UNDRIP. So it's the preamble, and the principles are in the legislation, and as you probably know, Parks Canada would behave and make sure that these principles are considered as we move forward. But we couldn't make any direct mention of it because it's not an act implementing UNDRIP itself. So it has to do with the drafting of the legislation, which is tricky sometimes, and we go with what justice is and drafters are suggesting. But keep in mind that we're responding to call to action 79.1, and there are progress made on all the call to actions by Government of Canada, and in particular Parks Canada for call to action 79 and then number 2 and number 3, which are addressing residential schools, commemoration, healing, as well as making changes to policy, which is happening as we speak. And in terms of what would be included in terms of engaging and consulting with Indigenous peoples, again, this would be going through the lens of duty to consult would be respected, but again, because it's not an act, it's just a bill. There's no more details that I can provide to you at this point.
Thank you.
Thanks, Genevieve. There are quite a few questions about the number of federal heritage places that are included. That number 300, I think, feels like a small number. If you could say a bit about that and the nature of the protection relationship with Treasury Board directives, how that works for federal heritage places.
And again, that's if the bill is adopted as written. I would say the number comes from the definition provided in the Act. And so if you look at the definition, it's quite broad. So you may have different currently designated places that are bundled together to make this number. So it goes with the definition provided in the Act for historic place. So, and again, this we are consciously saying over 300 because it's not a firm number right now. We would need to see what was designated in recent past, etc. So it's just to provide an idea of the magnitude of it. About the Treasury Board directive policy, and again, if the bill was to become legislation and be enacted, the Treasury Board Secretariat would amend their Treasury Board directive to reflect that we now have legislation in place. So I know there was a question about currently existing designated recognized federal buildings. They would still be subject to the Treasury Board directive as they are currently. It's not because you're not picked up by legislation that you're left out of the equation.
Thanks, Genevieve.
Natalie, I think Julie Harris has her hand up, but maybe she needs to be promoted to speaking.
I don't see her hand, but Emily, can you make that change? And while we're waiting for that, I see a question from Dinu Bumbaru at Heritage Montreal about monitoring and follow-up of that, the proposed requirement for federal departments to consult and use the standards and guidelines. And I think public consultation is also part of his question.
So, and again, should this bill become an act, there would be surveillance applied, because at that moment, anything that is mentioned as an obligation in the legislation would become mandatory for federal departments to apply and obey to. So there would be a need at Parks Canada to be monitoring those consultations and make sure that things are, running as they should be.
Sorry, Natalie, there must have been a mistake around Julie Harris. She didn't have her hand up. Question that also came up here, though, was I guess there was the mention of the public register in C-23, but it sounds like it's, from what I can gather, it would only be limited to National Historic Sites or classified heritage buildings. What happens, I guess somebody was asking in the chat about the Canadian Register of Historic Places, which has 22,000 structures across the country, recognized at different levels of government. Is there any cross intersection between these two in this bill, or I wonder if you could comment on that?
I can give a general comment on that. So again, because legislation is looking at what would become mandatory, the obligation would be for federally owned historic places designated by Government of Canada to be listed. It doesn't mean that we cannot add to these places on the register. So it's really about what would be mandatory and not to exclude what could be posted in addition to these. So I don't know if it's a half an answer to your question, but again, it's to indicate what would come and be happening the day the act would come into force, though there is a 3-year period for federal departments to be also applying all the provisions in the act. So to give sufficient time to all departments to be able to do the mandatory obligations in legislation.
Thanks, Geneviève. I'll encourage other panelists, feel free to jump in. I might just raise a question about a gap, I think, that has been perceived in the proposed bill. Many of us have seen the challenges that the public and the heritage sector have faced around cases like the Chateau Laurier and now the current challenge at the Stephen Avenue in Calgary, where these are nationally significant places that bear that designation, but where there is no federal, there's no protection that comes along with that designation. So I'm not seeing anything in the bill that would address that. Do you have any comments? Was that part of the discussions in the development of the bill, Geneviève?
So again, the bill has been drafted as approved by cabinet. So meaning that it was also responding to a mandate letter that our minister received from Government of Canada, and the scope that was indicated was to protect federally owned historic places as a first step into, as John Aldag, MP John Aldag explained, this is a first good step into that direction. And there's also provinces, territories, we've met with them a few times, and staying in our jurisdiction was important to many. And again, how do you intervene in something that you do not have jurisdiction for is always an interesting question.
Thanks, Geneviève. Would anyone on the panel here like to ask a question, and then maybe we'll move to an in-camera session, as it were? Or anything else you're seeing in the chat or the Q&A that you'd like to have answered live today?
Maybe I'll just say that because I see some concerns that other acts would not be. An act like this one would need to work in parallel and work hand in hand with any other acts that exist and are in existence, and language acts, Indigenous and language acts, for example, would be one. I just also want to mention that there are things we do under legislation, but there are things we do under programs, initiatives, and we will not stop doing those things, and we will continue looking at what are the best vehicles to being able to do a fulsome job under the protection and conservation of historic places in Canada. So again, this has to do with legislation for federally owned historic places, but there are other things, and Government of Canada is advancing a lot of good reconciliation initiatives, and Parks Canada is always the one wanting to be part of these, and we will continue.
Great, thanks, Geneviève. Maybe at that point, we'll thank Geneviève and Norman and John Aldag.
I have one question, if I may, Natalie.
Sure.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank Ms. Charrois for pointing out that there is more than one tool in the federal toolbox. I think that's important to retain. I think it's also important to retain Mr. Aldag's observation that there's still a lot more work that needs to be done. And there are various ways to do it. There's C-23, but there are also other mechanisms that are available. I think those are two very key and helpful observations. The one thing I am concerned about is that if you want to do more work, you don't want to have to go back to Parliament every couple of years and try to get an amendment to the legislation. Usually what happens is there's regulatory powers that are conferred upon the cabinet, and the governor and council can make regulations about this, it can make regulations about that. But in C-23, the only regulatory power that's spelled out, it's section 34, is the regulatory power for lands under Parks Canada. Really, the cabinet seems to have tied its own hands in terms of doing anything supplementary on this front. So one of the thoughts that I'm sure is shared by a lot of people in this Zoom is, when regulations come out, how can they be most helpful? How can they be helpful to Parks Canada? How can they be helpful to the federal government? And how can they be helpful to heritage? And yes, it's possible to say, oh, well, let's leave that to after second reading and we'll let the committee sort it all out. Well, how can we start a dialogue to make sure that our thinking and your thinking actually fit each other? How can we support each other to make sure that when amendments do get proposed at committee, they're amendments that the government can say, yeah, we're cool with that? How do we do this?
That's a very good question you're asking. So I'll say on the regulatory front, you're right that there's a few regulations mentioned in the legislation. I will just though mention that the minister has provided some authority in that bill that goes beyond fairly owned historic places or what is covered in the provision. So we are opening the door to doing more work on many more fronts. So the authority would be there. But again, there is this question of regulation, but there would be the question of also the financial means to be able to do that. And once again, we would need to go back to a cabinet for any financial decisions made into the future. So understood. So regulations as they are drafted or proposed right now would be more for Parks Canada to really complement what Parks Canada is currently doing on national parks under National Parks Act and other National Marine Conservation Act, etc. But regulation or monitoring, I would say, is going to be key and an important part of what we're doing. But I feel that there is a door open to doing more, working with provinces, territories, working with others, and developing more tools, more toolkits, etc. into the future. Standards and guidelines will continue to be a pan-Canadian framework document, and we will continue to engage with provinces and territories should we be wishing to open it, redo it, renew it, add Indigenous knowledge to it, etc. So thinking this is a good first step, but I get your point that parliamentary process is the way into probably having some further amendments being considered.
Well, I'll ask the question very simply. What do you recommend to best assure that our guys can work with your guys?
I cannot make any comments on that because that's the purview of Parliament. But I'm sure that your upcoming conversation will guide you into how you could make this happen.
And I'll just jump in as I get ready to jump off the call. I look forward to receiving the feedback that Natalie and her team will be leading. But thank you so much to everybody. It's great seeing so many leaders in the heritage conservation field joining the call today. As I look through the questions, there's really good thought being given to this, and I look forward to receiving your feedback to help champion and provide opportunities for you to bring your comments forward to help strengthen this first run at improving heritage legislation in Canada in a long time, and hopefully building a foundation for future steps to be taken. But thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. And I look forward to whatever summary you can provide us, Natalie.
Great. No, thank you so much for your time, and we'll definitely be in touch. So stay tuned.
Take care.
In closing, I will just say we're in the height of Historic Places Days, this relatively new national celebration of historic places. So it's one way that we can bring national attention to historic places in Canada. So make sure you check out the website, visit places, participate in the contest, help build a lot of momentum on social media and on the ground for these places that matter to all of us, and gear up to be with us in Toronto for our conference, October 20 to 23, 2022 in Toronto. So looking forward to seeing you all there. Great. Great. Merci beaucoup. We'll be following up with the recording and an email message and looping you into future discussions. Thank you. À la prochaine.